You have, all right. Thank you so much, Tara, and all of the organizers. I am thrilled and very, very honored to be here. From her writings and her presentations that I've had an opportunity to see for many years, now and then, and increasingly through wonderful, always informative and helpful email exchanges. And Fausto-Sterling has been one of the best teachers I've ever had, and is certainly one of the most important thinkers that I've encountered. And so it's just an honor beyond what I can tell you for me to be a part of this today. Thank you. I want to also give a couple of other acknowledgments. The ideas that I'm going to produce are all, that I'm going to tell you about are all collaboratively produced through work and conversations with Annalise Kaiser, Cordelia Fine, Gina Rapon, Katrina Karkazis, Jean Mager-Stellman, Kristen Springer, and Kili Cheslak-Postova. Those are the main people that I've collaborated with. Almost all of my work has been collaborative, which is really exciting and brings particular kinds of challenges, but I think is always worth it. And all of us draw upon an even broader network of feminist scientists and scholars of STS. Most especially today, I pulled forward ideas that draw very heavily on Anne's work. So I gave you the title of Sex as Chimera, and I wanted to just quickly give you 3 different definitions for chimera in which actually, by the end of the talk, I hope to have convinced you that sex fulfills all of these kinds of definitions. The first one, a fire-breathing she-monster in Greek mythology. I love that one. The B part of that, an imaginary monster compounded of incongruous parts. That's a very important definition to keep in mind. Second, an illusion or fabrication of the mind, especially an unrealizable dream. And third, an individual organ or part consisting of tissues of diverse genetic constitution. I'm not going to have time to explore this third one very much, but it's actually a very fun one that really does apply. So I'll keep going from there. So or moving forward from both Ginger and Anne's presentations, a theme that you hear is this definition of sex and this interesting, difficult boundary of gender and sex. And I'm mostly going to be talking in relation to brains and behavior. This applies to thinking about bodies more generally, and maybe we can talk about that later. Of course, none of us dispute the reality or materiality of bodies. Specific intra- and intercellular mechanisms, properties, potentials, the capacities and limits of specific tissues, organs, systems, and so on are not what we're questioning. The question that Anne has pushed at various points, and which I take up today, is how the concept of sex connects with the material body. And this demands additional questions like the following. What kind of variable is sex? How is sex entangled with gender? In the realm of neurosciences and psychology, we must ask, how does sex gender get into a brain, if indeed it is found there, picking up Ginger's question. How do investigators understand disagreements among the levels and dimensions of sex and gender? For example, does classification by subjects, or of subjects by sex at the level of person also work to classify brains or parts of brains by sex, and so on? What about other aspects of biology? As Sarah Richardson has recently asked, does it make sense to use the concept of sex to describe X and Y chromosomes? For example, there are many wonderful iterations of these questions. But on the other hand, these questions are not exactly completely new, and it might be seen as a lack of progress, that they're still being raised. I want to suggest instead that these are perennially wise questions, like the innocent, irritating questions of children who refuse to accept simple appeals to authority, because I said so, or teleology, because it is. As an answer, the repetition of these fundamental questions forces us to articulate the very most difficult core constructs that we work with in gender and sexuality studies, as well as in the sciences. So now 3G sex is a a term that was recently introduced by the neuroscientist Daphne Joel as a way to explain that the familiar model of binary sex is not a good model for understanding brain variations. Her full passage, I won't read the whole thing to you, but the core components of it are the combined genital, gonadal, and genetic sex, which she refers to as 3G sex, is internally consistent in roughly 99% of humans. She is quite careful to point out that it's not internally consistent everywhere, and that no one of these three is actually a binary variable. But nonetheless, that there is a very high degree of internal consistency in this composite variable of sex. It's a much higher degree of internal consistency than you see in most multidimensional variables, and so scientists feel justified in using this as a singular variable. At the same time, though, the fact that these two types of, the intersex refers to the phenomenon where somebody either has an intermediate form at one or more levels, or is male in one of these dimensions and female in the others, or is otherwise mixed. But using this model to understand sex differences in other domains, in particular the brain and behavior, leads to the erroneous assumption that sex differences in these other domains are also highly dimorphic and highly consistent. In addition to the fact that neither brain structures nor any behaviors or functional features are as dimorphic as any one of these 3G dimensions, there's dramatic independence across the different constituent elements of both brain morphology, the structures within our brains, and among aspects of cognition, emotion, etc., that are understood typically as female, feminine, or male, masculine. I'm going to show you three different models that have been used over the years for understanding sex and gender. We'll start with this bipolar model. So this is an old familiar model. This is a very folk model, if you will, where it's all along one dimension of sex, that things run between poles of masculine and feminine. Being more feminine necessarily within this model entails being less masculine, and vice versa. But everything can roughly be placed on there. Now, this was discarded even in very mainstream psychology and neuroscience quite a long time ago, in the 70s. It's interesting that Sandra Bem proposed a two-dimensional model in psychology. Neuroscientists, a few years later, came up with a two-dimensional model. You'll never see them crediting Sandra Bem for that, by the way, but that's just a little aside. So in this orthogonal model, or two-dimensional model, you have separate dimensions of masculine traits and feminine traits. And it's quite possible to be either masculine but not feminine, or to be masculine and feminine. It's also quite possible to be not particularly masculine and not particularly feminine. So you can follow those different positions and possibilities throughout that. Nonetheless, it suggests that the elements of those dimensions of cognition or the brain themselves nonetheless are best understood as being either fundamentally masculine or feminine. They're things that should load onto those dimensions from, again, it's sort of a factor analysis perspective. Now there's a third model, and this is the mosaic model. I wish that I could figure out how to get that graphic to stay tangled longer, so let me go back for a second. I just want you to look at that tangle. So the idea of this tangle here is that we have all of these cross-cutting dimensions, and that the thickness and the width, and it's supposed different lines or arrows are longer and some are shorter. I'm trying to give some kind of way of suggesting to you that some of these dimensions are more tightly associated with sex or gender. Other ones have broad distribution. Some of them are only lightly correlated, and so on. But they're all going in lots of different directions. They're not on the same planes with each other. If you were to take these elements apart, you can think about this tangle as being either a tangle that represents brain structures that people typically think of as male or female, or cognitive and emotional traits that people think of as masculine or feminine. When you actually think about them individually, you can see that in this model, where you get the idea that any of these is male or female or masculine or feminine is precisely that you can look at a group of people and that you'll find average differences if you do a male-female comparison on any of them. And in each one, you can array them so that there's a masculine side and a feminine side and a general cut point, and that their females tend to fall on one side, males tend to fall on the other. That tend to is really important. Every single one of those differences is a continuous difference. There's no categorical difference in any of these features that we would be talking about. So you go on and you see what happens if you think about individuals. So if those little yellow points are where some individual person might line up on each of those different features of brain or behavior in relation to that midpoint, a population midpoint, or in relation to being on the male side or the female side. And what you see is somebody might sort of cluster around the middle and have more features on one side or the other. You might see an individual here, for example, who is on the female side on most everything and a central part. This individual, especially the more you multiply the characteristics you're looking at, this is a very unusual individual, actually. Our folk notions lead us to expect that people are going to look this way, but this is not actually the typical state of affairs. What you see instead often is something much more like this. To break it down briefly, if you know where I score on a spatial relations test, that's actually not going to tell you anything about how I score on a dominance test, or how aggressive I am, or what my verbal abilities are, or how empathic or nurturing, and so on. And that's not just me. It's true of in general. So the fact that some person has a feminine trait in one element completely doesn't allow you to predict that the same person will be feminine for any other element. Instead, individual people show a great deal of internal variety in these respects. So what's the best way to describe this state of affairs? Joelle's idea is to suggest that humans are typically neither male nor female, but intersex in terms of both brain and psychological gender. Now, I disagree with Daphne here. The notion that intersex is the typical state of affairs in the brain and behavior is appealing insofar as it challenges the pervasive pathologization of people with intersex traits. That's the appealing part. But the term intersex suggests that any brain structures or psychological functions that differ at the group level between males and females are proper elements of some phenomenon called sex. And however, if all these traits of brain and behavior don't hang together like 3G sex does, and you can't use these traits to predict the 3G sex of the individual or any of the other traits, why keep calling them by the same term? If we were doing a factor analysis, if we were moving at this from the data itself instead of from the idea of sex, we would never arrive at sex as a variable. So Katrina Karkazis, my colleague who I'm working with on the Olympic project, has written, and I love this passage in her book, Fixing Sex, if one postulates bodies, including genitals, gonads, chromosomes, and hormones, what more does the word sex buy us? The body as a material fact is given, but sex is not. This is a reminder that attachment to sex gender as a framework can, or maybe inevitably does, lead to loss of information. This is clear in sex-specific medicine, for example, where average differences in risk factors between males and females are used as justification for using sex-specific treatments. But sometimes the risk factors themselves are readily knowable, and sometimes covariates with sex or gender, which are also readily knowable, are better predictors. A really great example of that is in a large multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, there were significant male-female differences in arterial elasticity, but it turned out that height was actually a better predictor of arterial elasticity than sex, that once you controlled for height, the sex correlation went away. There are a number of other interesting examples of this, and it's worth recognizing that if you then use sex or gender as a proxy for choosing treatments, you're going to have an unnecessary loss of information, and at worst, gross misclassification that will lead to bad treatment. So the analogy to the function of sex as a variable in medicine is useful because neuroscience research on sex gender is so often justified with the argument that this will advance medical knowledge and treatment, especially for mental health problems that show sex disparities. So I believe that using the term intersex to describe human brains represents a missed opportunity to challenge the potentially infinite expansion of sex that is afforded by the pervasive habit of comparing males and females and the availability of ever larger subject groups and ever finer instruments for discerning physical and functional differences. Habitual comparisons will always yield differences. It's just a property of statistics and large groups. Expanding this catalog of differences between males and females may be confused with generating actual understanding about what such differences mean, what they might reveal about function, how they illuminate important questions about human development, variety, health, and illness. But in fact, that catalog doesn't do that. Now, as Anne and many others have demonstrated through close analyses of scientific practices and interpretations, scientists and other people routinely and inappropriately treat phenomena as dimorphic as soon as they are labeled sex or gender. So, in other words, you go from this tangle, right, but to know it as sex or gender, you pull the tangle apart, you array it along an arbitrarily chosen dimension of sex/gender. And it forces, conceptually, there's a lot of wonderful work out there that shows how it forces dimorphic thinking into how you treat those variables. So mosaicism is not a new concept, but it might be that calling it sexual mosaicism or neural sexual mosaicism, as Sandra Whittleson actually initially framed it, is one reason that mosaicism is acknowledged, but it's very rarely emphasized in mainstream brain research. As long as aspects of the mosaic seem to be sex, there's conceptual pressure towards this dimorphic model, even in the face of all the evidence of actual male-female overlap, as well as the kind of dimensional independence that I described. So as an example, there's a recent article on it, which is a reframing of sexual differentiation of the brain, put forward by Margaret McCarthy and Arthur Arnold in 2011. And in this piece, McCarthy and Arnold strike a good many blows to the classic 20th century model, this what they call the serial model, in which genetic sex determines gonadal sex and gonadal hormones determine brain sex. That's a quote from them. And they make way for a model that involves multiplication of the mechanisms and factors involved, including a greater role for both direct genetic effects outside of the X or Y chromosome, and also the role of sex-specific environments. Now, I can't resist noting that they very matter-of-factly state in this piece that, of course, the old hormonal brain organization model doesn't capture it, and that's not really true. Now, unless you know my work, you don't know why this cracks me up, because this is what my book Brainstorm was about, and many of the same neuroscientists whose work I examined, and later Margaret McCarthy, very firmly defended that model and said that I had, sort of somehow been a little bit too choosy about the studies that I looked at or something. So it's an exciting little tidbit that they bury as if it's old news. And maybe we should cite them early and often on the obituary for brain organization theory, and we'll see if the deadness of the theory might stick this time. So anyway. McCarthy and Arnold's complexity and nuance in this piece, which is considerable, it's actually a really great piece, regarding the mechanisms of differentiation is really impressive. At the same time, their approach to the outcome of development is oddly flat. Tucked away in the legend of one of their figures, which is figure 4, the illustration of their model, is an acknowledgement that, quote, variability in the degree to which brain regions are masculinized or feminized in one individual results in a mosaic of relative maleness or femaleness. They identify this as an important aspect of their redefined model, but it's absent from their heuristic illustration and indeed from their text, which is sprinkled with misleading terms such as the male and female phenotype, male and female brain, feminine adult, or masculine adult. Throughout the text, they're talking about unitary phenotypes, and it in no way reflects what's actually supposed to be an important aspect of the model. So here is the heart of the problem. When it comes to brains and behavior, female, feminine, and male, masculine phenotypes do not exist, except as hypothetical composites. Unlike female or male genitals, which roughly describe types that can be observed or used to categorize individuals, albeit imperfectly, brain or behavioral phenotypes are not individual level phenomena. Brain or behavioral phenotypes of sex gender are not individual level phenomena. Because of the high degree of overlap between sexes and within sex variability, specific brain areas or aspects of psychology that are labeled as with sex can be known as such only at the group level. And because of the independence of these elements, mosaicism within individuals, they do not cohere into actual composites, even at the group level. Sex, then, is a non-empirical phenomenon when it comes to brain and behavior. What appears to be sex is the pure effect of research methods, habitual comparisons of males and females, and of a commitment to abstract composites or ideal types that are frankly counterfactual. Now, keep in mind, I'm not disputing 3G sex. I'm saying that this is actually not, it's a counterfactual model when you're thinking about anything about psychology and brains. So how does it come about that we are so convinced that these things work? So I'm going to show you 7 easy steps to the sexual brain. First, and this is how you get there, it's easy peasy. This is a self-help manual. It guarantees that you will get funding in some of the new programs in sex difference neuroscience, because there's a gigantic new funding stream to do this. Okay, so you begin by splitting every sample into female and male. Use their identities or use 3G sex. Second, you compare females and males on everything you can think of, and then you report only the differences. You then transform the differences from quantitative overlapping distributions to qualitative by calling them female type or male type. The next thing you do is use the same term, sex, for the construct used to group the subjects, which was roughly dimorphic in the subject group, and the construct that emerges from comparison, which is dimorphic only after the transformation. Number 5, you ignore rampant misclassification. What that means is pay no attention to the fact that a large minority of subjects who are male at the level of person will be female at the level of any particular brain area or behavioral trait, and vice versa. Next, you repeat these steps in different subject groups and with different methods, but always creating dimorphic constructs through active transformation of continuous phenomena. And finally, you also continue using the same term, sex, for the a priori and emergent constructs, and the same category for terms female and male for each. Ignore the fact that across individual persons identified their identity and their 3G sex, times the structure A, or figure the person by structure A, by structure B, by structure C, and so on. So you're looking at sort of cross, like a matrix, a correlation matrix of people in these areas. The construct of sex has dramatically low internal consistency. It drops. It's already low if you look even at 2 structures or 2 traits. Beyond that, it's vanishingly small. Okay. So what are you going to do from there? Well, the old-fashioned thing to do would be to start down here with what runs along the bottom. That's sort of the classic model. You have groups that are simplified as the most important thing in there is, some kind of idea of initial underlying sex biology. You do an experiment. You capture this sort of any kind of difference in your experiment has a straight line right back to that initial aspect of biology, and you don't really have to think about too much else beyond that. But then the other thing that you could do is, it turns out that we're in a really exciting era of where feminist insights are actually being tested, revised, and expanded by careful and specific empirical research, exploring the relations of particular developmental conditions and mechanisms to particular forms of brain structures, physiological functions, or behavior. One of the best examples of this is the study of the emergence of sex differences in early life, undertaken by Anne and her colleagues in their Sexing the Baby project. But there are others doing this work as well. Feminist neuroscientists Anneliese Kaiser in Switzerland, Debelina Roy in the US, Gillian Einstein in Canada, Raffaella Rumiati in Italy, just to name 4 of my favorites, are translating years of feminist thought experiments into empirical explorations of sex gender, not as a trait of people or brains, but as a situation or a context that is sometimes quite salient, but nearly always contingent. Thinking about sex gender as one of the functions facilitated by particular aspects of biology or behavior, instead of as the true purpose or driving force behind these, is probably the most important conceptual shift in this work. So you see, this scheme that I'm showing you here is actually coming from a piece that is coming out, I hope. Actually, that's a little premature. It's a piece that I've been working on with Cordelia Fine, Gina Rippon, and Anneliese Kaiser. And if you notice, what we tried to do here is show the different ways, first, that the social world, in fact, gets entangled into this phenomenon that ends up in the experiment. So you can't just look at the males and females that show up in an experiment and think that the differences that you observe are due to biology. You have to know that the social world has always been active in shaping those differences that emerge. Next, you have to think very concretely about the aspects of the experiment itself. So it's always entangled, and then here you want to really particularly note that your methods are also entangled, just as an example, with stereotype threat, and with the feedback of results into popularization, which then turns into a new loop with gender socialization via stereotype threat that happens both before and during your experiment. So the final piece that I want to just point out that happens is, in the end, your results are not the stable state of affairs that you expect to see everywhere, but they're a snapshot, and you recognize that those results are going to always be contingent. So what's the fate of sex? I can't tell you how thrilled I was to see this quote in a very mainstream neuroscience article just coming out about a month ago, and quoting J.B.S. Haldane. Now, my own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And I will only say that the work on entanglement is something that is finally going forward. I am over my time, so I can't talk more than 1 second about the fact that that one of the most important things that's happening in this, for some reason my slide, it won't show that part of the animation, is to show that sex and gender are completely also co-constructed with other social domains, and that they are not just dimensions of difference, but they're dimensions of power. They're differential, they're power hierarchies, and those are things that are also being recognized with the entanglement. I'm sorry it didn't show on my slide, but I thank you very much again.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, wait for the microphone, if you can, which is...
I'll just speak very loud.
Okay, speak loudly.
I just have a quick question about whether you think that a more open discussion about trans people is affecting this kind of research.
It's a really good question. I don't know. I'll tell you that I do a whole lot of work in the Netherlands, and the phenomenon of trans is so different in the United States from the Netherlands that that actually raises a whole lot of interesting avenues for thinking and moving forward. I don't feel like I have a good, ready answer to that, except to say that much of the mainstream work on for example, brain organization theory, the work that's done in humans. Trans people have been used, and I mean that in every sense of the word, as research subjects from very, very early on. And there are, in particular, some of the looping effects that you can see in the kind of design that I laid out are pretty clear, I think, and commented upon when you see, for example, the relationship between trans people and research communities in cognitive neuroscience in the Netherlands versus in the US. This is an issue that hasn't, to my knowledge, been really discussed in very deep or extended ways in trans scholarship yet, but I think it'd be really interesting to do.
Anne and then Elizabeth.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Are there any male researchers doing this work on sex and gender that are notable?
Who are doing the kind of contextual contingent research like that?
Yes.
You know, it's interesting. I know a couple of male researchers who are, in fact, who approach sex in this way in their work. What's interesting is they're not sex researchers per se, but when they do engage sex as a variable in their work, they don't just treat it as a stable, knowable, permanent trait that individuals have. One is my own mentor, Evan Balaban, who I think does this quite beautifully. Evan Balaban is a really amazing cognitive and developmental neuroscientist. He almost never takes sex as the subject of his work, but he looks at, for example, he looks at sex differences in birdsong. It's a major part of his work, and he's very interesting in doing that. Yeah.
Thank you. This was wonderful, as always. Can I get you to back up to the 3G sex business?
Sure.
I wasn't following you quick enough.
Sure.
You're saying that, if you go back to the slide, are you saying
Sure.
that the genetic, gonadal, genital thing lines up 90-something% of the time?
99% of the time.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more? Because I take this that you're taking this as some kind of anchor against which you want the behavioural complexity to emerge.
Yeah.
Can you say something, because obviously genetics, gonads and genitals are all internally inconsistent.
Yeah.
I mean, genetics, folds. Can you say a little bit more about how that 3G is internally inconsistent?
Well, actually,
or is it not? I mean,
it's
can you say more
not
about
in quite the same way. So here's the thing it's a little, I'll admit, I'm actually really glad for your question. It's a complicated question, and I'm glad for it in part because I'm ambivalent about using 3G sex as this foil, but at the same time, I think I keep coming back to it. I feel like it's a useful foil, at least as a step. I think it's important to recognize that it isn't that none of these elements are in fact dimorphic, that none of these elements lines up perfectly. And at the same time, because of, I think here's the issue. Scientists, especially anybody working with humans on any kind of research, they don't expect perfect variables and constructs and perfect correlations, within good constructs ever. And if you look at the behavior of this as a composite, it has quite high internal consistency and quite good factor analytic predictivity across people in the way that you would expect for other kinds of useful variables that you could predict things with. And that's one of the reasons that I go ahead and hold on to this for now. But that wonderful quote at the end that I gave you about the wonderfully queerer world is actually part of a very recently emerging body of work on genetic mosaicism. And here we're not talking about X and Y, we're talking about whole genome mosaicism. And what's really exciting in the piece that I quote from is that, well, first of all, mosaicism has been understood to exist for quite a long time, but in recent years it has been just discovered far more frequently than had been the case. And it turns out that it's actually the rule, it's not the exception, that mosaicism is found dramatically. And what's even more exciting is that the brain is apparently the home of the most intense mosaicism that has been found yet in the body. And so there are ways in which, if you think, beyond X, Y, and you think about the way that X and Y are not independent elements somewhere, but the kinds of contingencies and interactions that are required for any sort of gene expression, I think the more we learn about broad mosaicism, the more we might even have to revise what a model like this can tell us as that foil.
That's very helpful, thank you. Because it seems to me that I see exactly what you're saying rhetorically.
Yeah.
And the strategy that you're in.
Right.
I get all that on board. But it seems that that very strategy that you're deploying is actually also internal to each
Yeah.
other. That it has a thing that's kind of separate from
Yeah.
attached to something that's diversifying.
Right. And I think that what it really comes down to is thinking about, I would like to see the concept of sex actually narrowed as much as possible to, when I think about sex not as a location in the body or as bits, but if we think about sex as a particular function that some tissues fulfill among other functions that they fulfill, some cells and tissues participate in functions of sex, I think sex could get restricted to actually thinking about reproduction. And I think that we could free up all of the other kinds of things that we've glommed onto that in ways that might be ultimately a lot more useful. Thank you.